Fuck Zelda 2. Sorry, that was a bit abrupt. I like Zelda 2, conceptually. I enjoy it a lot more than Metroid 1, but once again I find my patience dwindling thanks to this game's combination of obtuse progression and unforgiving difficulty. I have a bit of a history with this game, much like Zelda 1. It's a game I have a lot of respect for thanks to certain elements of the design, but up until this video series I hadn't bothered to play through to completion. Which, unfortunately in this case, it'll likely remain that way, because unlike Zelda 1, I just can't be fucked to beat this one. It's a shame too, there's not really any other game out there with this gameplay style, save for Adventure Time, Hey Ice King, Where Do You Steal Our Garbage for DS and 3DS. There's a lot of potential here, and I'd like to see it capitalized upon in a meaningful way. Though given my track record with NES critiques, you could be forgiven for thinking I hate most NES games, and that's probably true, but that's mostly because a lot of them were shovelware. I actually do enjoy a lot of the big-name titles. It's just unfortunate that my big two exceptions, Zelda 2 and Metroid 1, happen to be among the first NES titles I happen to tackle on this channel. But enough with the prologue, let's get started. The story is a jumbled mess, and normally I would ignore it if it didn't interfere with the gameplay, but for whatever reason, Zelda 2 just loves to rub its terrible writing in your face. Maybe it was better in the Japanese, as these NES translations often are, but the US version is what I have, so I'm going to bitch about it. Following up after Zelda 1, Zelda 2's attack mode screen is a lot more vague. To Zelda 1's credit, they kept it simple. But not Zelda 2. No, here we got talk of a sleeping spell cast on Zelda after the defeat of Ganon, but apparently this isn't the same Ganon from Zelda 1 according to the official lore, so how he died and how Zelda got the spell cast on her in the first place is up in the air. There's talk of going into a palace to place crystals while going on the, and I quote, most adventuresome quest yet. Are you confused? Good, so am I. Maybe the guidebook that came with the game says something about it, but I'm only working with what the game feels like telling me. So how does this interfere with gameplay? Well, this particular example doesn't. I brought this up solely to contrast Zelda 1's elegant simplicity. No, where the story's problems lie are in the villages, NPCs, and vague nonsensical dialogue. I got stuck at a wall after the first dungeon because of a jump spell the game doesn't tell you that you need. Had to look up a guide to figure that out. The experience of making progress in this game, sheerly on the narrative level, knocks the game down a peg. Which is a shame, because this is the first Zelda game in the series to try and flesh out the world with more meaningful interactions with its characters beyond old men and caves showing you their oddly shaped swords and shopkeepers, who somehow managed to find business in the desolate wasteland that was Hyrule. I can certainly respect the attempt to push the series forward through interacting with other characters, and like I said, I'm sure this worked fine in Japanese, but with the shoddy English translation, it's completely unbearable without a guide, and that about sums up my issues with the story's attempts to impede progress. But there's certainly more where that came from in the gameplay department. Now, the gameplay of Zelda 2 is very interesting, and unique, I wager. It's both a top-down adventure and a side-scroller. The bulk of your exploration of the world will be handled by exploring the top-down overworld, while towns, caves, dungeons, and miscellaneous areas are explored from a side-scroller perspective in place of what would normally be considered combat instances of, say, a JRPG. And Zelda 2 is an RPG in a sense. An action RPG, though perhaps that's being a bit generous. You have 3 stats you can level up: attack, magic, and health. I personally never noticed much of a change from leveling up anything that wasn't attack, but it's there. I'm honestly not really a fan of this approach to game design for Zelda 2, since growth through progression and acquiring items is far more interesting and rewarding for an exploration-heavy game than, say, grinding for 2 hours because you're losing patience with the game and want to speed things up, but the process of leveling up doesn't really seem to impact your ability to progress in a substantial way, sorry. That's just my bitterness talking. Okay, well that's not entirely true. The game does bar progress in other ways, such as locked doors, keys, and strange old men in the house cellar that teach you magic. Why do the Zelda games love sticking old men in suspicious locations? I suppose that's another first for the series. Not old men in cellars. The magic thing. Yes, this is the first Zelda game to introduce magic, and it doesn't really handle it well. You've got magic that boosts defenses, recovers health, and increases your jump height, amongst other things. And all those things are either permanent upgrades in the previous game, or came in the form of an item drop. If you ask me, this is a bit of a downgrade in terms of game design. It means your progress can be completely barred by not having enough magic to jump higher. Or if you're unable to heal because the spells cost an exorbitant amount to use. It's an interesting concept, but it's woefully mishandled. The crux of the game for me, what made me quit, is the combat. You guys remember my Metroid 1 review, right? It's kind of the opposite problem I had with that game's combat design. While both Zelda 2 and Metroid have simple gameplay, neither of them handle enemies well. In Metroid's case, for those that might not have watched, the problem was enemy placement. Either they'd place enemies in positions where getting hit was completely unavoidable, or you'd be overwhelmed by the sheer volume of enemies in a given area. Conversely, Zelda 2 actually keeps most screens to 1 or 2 enemies at a time, and while admittedly the weaker enemies are easy to deal with, the hard enemies tend to have unfair movesets that make damage next to impossible to avoid. Iron Knuckles are probably the most obvious example. They are capable of blocking your attacks while they themselves attack, but I swear those fuckers read your inputs. Gorillaz aren't too bad, but they throw boomerangs at both upwards and downward angles, and since Link's natural jump height is fairly low, it makes a lot of their attacks unavoidable, especially since they're normally encountered in narrow passages. It becomes very difficult to avoid their attacks, though they aren't as damaging as some of the other enemies. Goombas aren't too bad in my opinion. I only bring them up because they're basically Hammer Bros, if they were more fair. Though the Hammer Bros comparison may be enough to clue you in as to why I think they could have been taken as bad design. But the worst enemy of all is the fucking Dairas. Their attacks never let up, they're hyper-aggressive, and they will hack you to shreds in seconds given the opportunity. I'm sure there are worse enemies further in, and I know there are stronger and yet more obnoxious variants of the enemies I just listed here, but we're not going to talk about those. I suppose it's not entirely fair to complain about the combat solely on the basis of enemy design and magic in this instance. Unlike Zelda 1, the basic combat is fundamentally flawed. Let's look at a game with a similar style to Zelda 2 that came out prior. Yes, Castlevania. The comparison is obvious, isn't it? A lot of the enemy behavior is similar, as is the core gameplay. Castlevania has its own issues, certainly, but the combat here has one thing Zelda 2 doesn't. Reach. Yes, you can actually hit enemies from a reasonably safe distance without putting yourselves in hacking distance to deal damage. I honestly think this is the biggest issue with Zelda 2. Sure, you have a sword beam, again, like Zelda 1, that'll give you reach, but it's lost at the slightest nick of the health bar, so it isn't exactly useful. There's also a live system, which I feel is overly punishing, but that may very well also be a factor in how tolerable I found the combat, but I don't exactly feel like dwelling on it. The actual level design and overworld are fine, if not a bit lifeless compared to Zelda 1, but for the most part, they're enjoyable. It's just a shame the game is held back by mishandled combat. And that about sums it up. Sorry this turned into me ranting about the game, but this is probably the only negative critique you'll be seeing from me about the Zelda franchise. I certainly can't afford the CDI game, so there's no chance of those games getting brought up. So is Zelda 2 worth trying? I know people that like it, so it's probably worth trying out at the very least. Like I said, I appreciate the concept behind the gameplay, but I don't think it was executed well. At any rate, I hope you all enjoyed the video. If you did, be sure to like and subscribe, and because of YouTube fuckery, I also recommend ticking the bell icons so you'll know when I put out new videos. Because apparently just subscribing doesn't mean anything to YouTube anymore. Pessimism aside, I hope you all have a fantastic night and that this video lit a fire under you.